to take on a human form is to be born into an utter miracle, and that we're never taught that. We never grew up in that way. Instead, and this is kind of where I thought you were headed, is that we've been brought up to think that human beings are the crown of creation. We're at the top of the pyramid, and everything kind of needs to sort of bow down to us for our utilitarian purposes. And James, that is a very lonely. I mean, it's not just hubris and arrogance. It's really lonely.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Adventures Through the Mind. I'm your host as always, James W. Jesso. This podcast is surrounds topics related to psychedelic culture, medicine, and research. And for myself, the part of the intention with the show and the desired outcome is that these conversations work like cultural artifacts that contribute to our individual and collective sense making on working with and through psychedelics to be better people and to live a better life for ourselves, in our relationships with life itself, with even the natural world, and to those who will follow us after we're gone. And with regards to our connection to the natural world, that's what this podcast is about. And before I read the overture, I'll just throw out a couple of key words to give you a sort of taste, to wet your whistle on this one. Deep ecology, nature-relatedness, collapse, dominator paradigm, earth spirituality, ecofascism, the profound grief of acknowledging the harms we have committed, the miracle of life, finding balance in facing collapse, doing the best we can, the psychedelic fungi teachers, Terence McKenna, and ceremonial communities of psychedelic practice. That's some keywords to give you a little taste of what this episode is going to be about. And here is the overture I've written for this episode, which you can read at jameswjesso.com in the show notes for this episode 156. We have been bred and raised and conditioned into seeing ourselves as separate, and the natural world as the engine and storehouse of materials to fuel civilization, as a place of things beneath the superiority of human intelligence, beneath the dominion of man and man's will on a hierarchy of value supposedly granted to us from on high. This separation, these hierarchies, are our beliefs manifest, but not the truth of how things are. And yet these beliefs are embedded within our very sense of self, and from them profound harm has been done. A harm that further exacerbates as we further act from these beliefs personally and collectively. To quote this episode's guest, Sky Otter, what does that mean? It means that the rock-bottom core sense of self that most humans carry with differing degrees of intensity is one that is fundamentally isolated from the rest of nature. But our perception of ourselves as separate is not based on reality. This basic error in our perceptual lens, or operating system, if you will, from which our creations emanate, leads to a culture that is at war with the earth that sustains it. Each of us, gripped by a gnawing fear that we are separate and alone, act in ways that are making our living womb, the earth, a tomb." End quote. Over the 10,000 or so years of our civilization's domination of the planet, we have brought destruction, demolition, and decimation to the wilds and the life that once flourished there. This is not easy for us to look at. As Joanna Macy writes, quote, "When you look at what's happening to our world, and it is hard to look at what's happening to our water, our air, our trees, our fellow species, it becomes clear that unless you have some roots in a spiritual practice that holds sacred and encourages joyful communion with all your fellow beings, facing the enormous challenges ahead becomes nearly impossible." End quote. Deep ecology is that route. It is a way of life that aligns ourselves with the natural world on every level of our lives, personally and collectively. It is to liberate ourselves from our anthropocentric superiority complexes and see the inherent value of all living beings, to root our sense of self in life itself, and to enter into ecstatic, beautiful relationship with the myriad forms life manifests as here on Earth: plants, animals, fungi, mountains, rivers, etc. It is to bring ourselves back into spiritual connection with nature, a connection with ourselves and with each other in community. We're going to explore deep ecology in today's interview with Sky Otter. Together, we're going to explore not only the problematic places we are in as a planet, but the profound healing potential still available to us personally and collectively through coming back into ecstatic communion and relationship with the Earth. Sky Otter, formerly known as Bill Pfeiffer, is the founder of Sacred Earth Network, which continues to implement leading-edge visions for over 25 years. In that time, Sky has made Russia a second home, having traveled there 44 times, assisting the environmental and indigenous movements through the Sacred Earth Network. This has given him a rare cross-cultural perspective. He has also led hundreds of spiritual ecology workshops, including men's and breath work. He has 25 years of experience in reevaluation counseling and Vipassana meditation, and has undergone extensive training with Siberian shamans. Sky has partnered with and designed experiential workshops with Joanna Macy, John Perkins, Lynn Roberts, Kathy Pedevillano, pardon me, Kathy, if I got that wrong, and John Seed. He has also spent much time in the U.S. Southwest learning about native medicine ways and the crucial importance of petroglyphs and pictographs. His book, Wild Earth, Wild Soul, A Manual for Ecstatic Culture, is a beautiful read and is what inspired the interview you're going to hear today. So that is the overture for this episode. We're talking with Sky Otter, formerly known as Bill Pfeiffer. Before we get into the interview, big thank you to my patrons on Patreon. You are what make this podcast possible. And so thank you to you, and especially the people whose names are listed in the show notes to this episode or at jameswjesso.com and on the screen here on YouTube. Did I already say that? So thank you to you. This podcast is brought to you by Patreon listeners. So if you're not yet a patron, do please become one. I'm going to give some more details about that after the show, so as to not front load too much Patreon talk at the beginning of the episode here. So yeah, you can head to patreon.com/JamesWJesso to become a patron, and I very much ask to do so if you are valuing the show and are in a place economically, financially to give back to the value that you're receiving. Other ways of supporting are financial or non-financial, and you can find links to how to support in those ways in the description to this episode. And thank you very much for doing so. Here's my interview with Sky Otter, formerly known as Bill Pfeiffer, episode 156 of Adventures Through the Mind. Enjoy. Why don't we jump into some sort of an interview structure dynamic from here?
Unless they want to just see us go back and forth for an hour and a half in a very, very informal way. But whatever, I'm ready when you are.
We'll see. Well, let's try to strike a balance between the two.
Awesome.
So I read your book over the course of this, basically the last couple of weeks, and it was really amazing how much I was reading it and being like, yeah. And this, you're not the first author that this has happened with, but having a book sort of spontaneously come my way and realize that the author, yourself in this case, was speaking to things that I had been sort of deeply churning over and even writing about myself in the weeks and months previous, in a way that sort of like affirmed, but then complemented what I had been writing, in a way that like I ended up weaving your book into my book, actually, and like quotes and stuff. But that's the one I'm working on. That'll come up. But the book, Wild Earth, Wild Soul, is this incredible sort of manual to what you say as being like the development or the creation of ecstatic cultures, and specifically through a kind of program or sort of event that you call the Wild Earth Intensive, if that's correct. And yeah, really excellent, like actually a manual. But in the midst of that manual, you weave in a lot of intellectual, spiritual, social, like sort of foundational concepts that allow for the why this matters process. And instead of trying to go into what is a Wild Earth Intensive and how do we do it and all that, I mean, listeners can access your book to get all that. You've encapsulated it incredibly well. What I'd like to focus on today is sort of one of the foundational elements of the why there, which is the connection with Earth and the and I guess in a sense the lack of connection that most of us experience, and the value of returning to that connection. So the initial question is sort of like, it's a half question, half statement, because there's the introduction, and then in the midst of your book is the discussion about deep ecology. So I'm wondering if you could give us a sense of the Earth connection being primary, lack of connection, and deep ecology into some sort of coherent start for the beginning of this today.
Well, we'll give it a shot. And as I said, it's great to meet you in this way. And so deep ecology arrived on the scene for me when I had been doing lots of what I would call classic environmentalism, where there's all this bad shit that's going on and somebody's got to do something about it. And I'd say the biggest piece of destruction that I was really feeling firsthand, because I was a woodworker at the time, and as I was working on the tropical woods, I actually felt, I heard. I don't know how it happened, but I felt, I heard, these forests are going really fast, and if humans don't do something about it, we're going to lose unbelievable amounts of biodiversity, and we're going to change the climate. So it was like, here I am working away in this woodworking shop, and the spirits of the wood are saying, you need to do something about this. And I was, I don't know, 28 or something like that. So that's when I started to get into what I call a classic environmental mode. And thank goodness, two super mentors came on the scene named John Seed from Australia, who's lesser known than Joanna Macy. But they introduced me to the fact that as much as important as it is to have these holding actions of stopping the destruction, if we don't get into this on a spiritual, emotional, embodied level and really understand that we are nature. I mean, it's just the silliest thing in the world that we've grown up in this sense of unbelievable separation where we're identified with our thinking process, and we're just, we're orphans from nature. We're locked out of creation, and what John and Joanna really were encouraging is for us to actually feel the heartbreak of that not only is it heartbreaking that biodiversity is getting slammed, and we could go on about the oceans, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the whole massive ecocide that's underway, but also how utterly alienating the culture that we've grown up in is, and how, I mean, that sense of alienation in a way is, that's the downside, where we say, this is what we don't want. What do we do want? And I think that's the segue into the book, and why, why you were, why you're pleased with it, because the book doesn't say, oh shit, we're fucked and there's nothing nothing that we can do about it, and we're just gonna, we actually could very well go down, but the excitement and the adventure of Deep Ecology is to get back into that realization that we're completely connected. We're one with things, and it's just like, oh wow. I mean, it's just, sometimes it's so obvious to me, because as I said before we started, I can still get wrapped up in the separation along with anybody else.
Mm-hmm. So there's a few cool bits there about that we're disconnected, and you speak to this in the book. You talk about the two core beliefs that sort of forward the, quote, age of expansion, and you speak to the consequences of that disconnection that we experience as post-industrial traumatic stress disorder. And what you're saying, so there's that, and then there's deep ecology as this thing where it's like, well, we're not just trying to protect the rainforest from getting destroyed, we're also trying to heal that disconnection so that we can be in that, not only in that relationship because it matters, but because it's us. It's us. And that informs our decisions rather than, whatever complex of value assessments would otherwise inform it based on the disconnection, which is usually, material resources. How does this benefit or harm us from like a social, industrial, political, financial standpoint? But like moving into that deep ecology, the deep ecology is the kind of activism that is inspired by and moving towards that sense of healing the connection disconnection. Have I got it?
You have it. And I think in this short time we've been talking already, what occurs to me more and more, and is really the centerpiece of all of my work, is that what to take on a human form is to be born into an utter miracle, and that we're never taught that. We never grew up in that way. Instead, and this is kind of where I thought you were headed, is that we've been brought up to think that human beings are the crown of creation. We're at the top of the pyramid, and everything kind of needs to sort of bow down to us for our utilitarian purposes. And James, that is a very lonely. I mean, it's not just hubris and arrogance. It's really lonely. And so deep ecology is kind of a vaccine. God forbid I should use that word, but you know what I mean. It's a way of it's medicine. It's a way of going right at that distortion, that sense of separation, and saying, let's actually not just talk about it, which is kind of fun philosophically, but let's actually experience this. So it's not just another head game. It's like, whoa, my experience over the course of, let's say you were referring to the 10-day Wild Earth Intensive, but it could happen in much shorter time frame, where I'm not only experiencing my kinship, I'm experiencing a subject-object dissolution. So that, yes, I have a sense of, there's this guy, Bill Pfeiffer, also known as Sky Otter, which I'm just really taking on as a newer persona because it really speaks to me. And so there is individuality and autonomy, but it is within this much larger frame of reference. And I can say it is such a relief to be living more and more in that place. And maybe the most satisfying thing of all is being with my brothers and sisters involved in that endeavor.
Yeah, when you talked about the dissolution of the subject-object divide, that for me, and one of the things I've been writing about, and I'll ask you about psychedelics a little bit later on, but is the experience of not just like, oh, I am nature and nature is me, I'm connected, but they're like, oh, my life, nature's life, my aliveness, it's alive, like alive. Some people are like, of course it's alive, but it's like, no, alive, like I'm alive, like the value of my life being, one, like as in equals yes, because I'm alive, is the same value as its life. Because it's alive, that life is valuable, rather than because its life provides humans these things according to what we determine as valuable, according to what we provides our needs, it's valuable insofar as it continues to provide those things. Mind you, we colonize our own life with that language as well. But now it's not just you're connected, but it's like, oh, it's alive. And I noticed, or you said this in a New Thinking Aloud interview, that not only are you alive and in kinship, but like the plants, the animals, the stars, etc., that's your family now. They're alive in a way that you can relate with them in that connection.
Yeah, exactly. What you just said is just becoming more and more obvious to me, and more miraculous only from the colonized mind standpoint. There is also something, you brought up psychedelics briefly, and I just, this is our natural state, James, and we've lost it. And so it's, what is it? We're working on paradise regained on, I think Joni Mitchell said something, we've got to get ourselves back to the garden. And so that's the plot, and that's that's our mission, and it's the most exciting thing that I can think of to be involved in, because it's not only kind of good for the plants and animals and everything else, but it's like what I've gotten many times is nature is fine. I mean, we can hammer away at the forms and take out a lot of species, but it's not like we want to be doing that. But it's kind of like this experiment of humanity. It's like we're the ones that need to be saved. I mean, we're the ones, and so we can save ourselves, but only through this larger expansion of consciousness. And that's what we're talking about. And it's, yeah, I guess I want to underline my enthusiasm that getting involved in this experientially and drawing on, and I know you're going to get to this, drawing on all of the traditional knowledge that goes back thousands of years is, again, it's just it's so satisfying, and we fall in love with each other and the world over and over and over again.
Yeah, there's two things that's coming up. I think the second thing will definitely sort of move us in the sort of next direction I have in mind. The first one is scientific research into nature relatedness, and that nature relatedness is directly correlated with increased positivity, well-being, sense of purpose and meaning, and an increased sense of nature relatedness, which is an increased sense of being connected to and identified with nature, has all these positive correlations, including increased pro-environmental behavior, attitudes, and perspective. Because of course, if I am nature, I'm going to be considerate about what I'm doing with these toxic chemicals that for some reason I have, or whether or not I'm going to cut this tree down. But that, and I think this is kind of what you're speaking to, and maybe I'll leave the second one for a minute, but what you're speaking to is that it's not as though we're at level and it's good. And if we connect with nature, it's better. It's that the positivity that we experience, that we track in people being connected to nature, is actually a restoration from a damage that's being done through the disconnection, because the opposite is also true in the research. People who are disconnected have a lower sense of life meaning and a number of other things, except for perhaps if they're so hyper attached to the corporate capitalist postmodern success mandate that they find meaning in domination, but that's aside. And I want to link back to something you mentioned in the book, which is post-industrial traumatic stress disorder. That it's not like, oh, this would make life better. It's like we are damaged. We're traumatized by the lack of connection, and the connection itself is a healing process. I wonder if you want to talk about that a little bit.
Separation, trauma, the colonized mind. For my money, out of this sense of deep separation and alienation, we hurt each other. We've been hurting each other. And it's not like hurting hasn't gone on for a long time, but systematic hurting, as in the current so-called civilization that we live in, is a violent culture, and it hurt people. So when you have a hurting culture, that trauma is just going to really spread in epidemic proportions. And I think that you mentioned the whole business of collapse at the beginning of our conversation, and you can't sustain that. So it's violence begets violence, and it's violence against nature, violence against ourselves are just semantics. It's all one sort of trauma that's being played out. There's a lot of other things going on besides that, but I think it's really valuable, like you just did, is just to name it. This is going on. Let's not bullshit ourselves. This is happening. Let's be real about it. And we can focus in lots of different ways, but I think that trauma, and all the ways it gets played out, trauma informed is a word, phrase that a lot of people are using now with Gabor Mate, etc. And I think this is trauma informed by ecocide.
Mm. Yeah, what you're speaking to there about the violence of the culture, I really see what you mean, because if we look back on what you said there about the sort of the hierarchy of value pyramid where humans are at the top, and it's funny because most people who are in that, especially secular people, don't tend to recognize that is a direct sort of inheritance from monotheistic religion, where all of man is beneath God, and then all of beneath man, I'm using that word specifically, is the dominion of man, right? And now God's gone, we killed him according to Nietzsche, and so now all we've got is just our own sort of self-obsession, and everything else exists beneath us. Well, then if you take that same unrecognized sort of ontological framing for life and you put it in different social systems, well, of course you're going to have, from the smallest scale to the largest scale, hierarchies of value where those who are higher have more dominating force and reason to dominate those lower. And you'll see that in all forms of systematic oppression, as well as how we conduct ourselves in the family and how we conduct ourselves. It's not a decentralized differentiation of value and collaboration. It's a value hierarchy, and those who are on the top deserve, I'm using air quotes, deserve more, and those who are on the bottom, it's warranted that they would then be taken from or oppressed for the benefit of those on top. And we see it obviously with nature, but then we also see it expressing itself in social systems as well.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And people at the top are just as miserable as anybody else. It's misery is misery is misery, and the current system, born from the worldview that we've been discussing, um, is a worldview of suffering. And so it's not like, oh yeah, the ruling class is just, whatever, having a great age of contentment and beauty and satisfaction. They're just as miserable as anybody else. So again, just to emphasize, this system, ecocidal, capitalism is a phrase you could use, but it's bigger than that. This diseased civilization really hurts everybody. And again, just because it's my thesis, maybe my life thesis, is that there's just so much more fun, joy, connection, exhilaration to be had by putting our energy in different ways and not getting sucked into the materialism that you spoke about before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I imagine that there are some people who are winning this finite game and are loving it, right? Although maybe they're suffering all the time as they continue to strive towards the love in it. But there are some who might not, for example, a great sort of case study. This is it's funny because I thought this was great, but it's kind of a lame mainstream example. But the recent YouTube mini series about Will Smith, The Best Shape of My Life, where he talks about writing his book and getting in the best shape but it's actually like a documentary expose of him like uncovering how he was deeply traumatized, and all of his success is this like reaction to this kind of suffering and like all this stuff that he like outlines in this thing. And it's like, yeah, there you go. This is like superstar, multi-million dollars, like whatever. And he's like at the top and he's like, I'm suffering because I got here because of all this trauma and all this whatever. So that's interesting. And a great series if you haven't watched it, if you're into that kind of stuff.
Well, this is sort of a funny aside, and it's a open judgment that I'm guilty of, but I'm just going to name it, which is that Will Smith has a huge heart. He is a beautiful man, and he will be vulnerable and show all his different parts to camera, on camera and so forth. And you've got guys like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos that just seem like they're kind of classics out of some Dickens novel of kind of Scrooge-like characters. And you could just sort of imagine, like, after you get your like 20th $billion, like, what is going on here? And I guess that's what sort of playing around in space is about, or something. It's like getting that thrill. And you know what? I have no idea what's going on in anybody's head. So I don't know. These are just like, snap judgments that have to do with my intuition and gut sense that it's a civilization of mystery, of misery that doesn't nobody escapes.
Mm. Yeah. When you spoke of Jeff Bezos, I had this, I don't know if I'm going to get like RCMP after me here, but I had this experience. There's a couple things. One, I was driving up to Algonquin National Park, which is a provincial park, beautiful, big, wild landscape in Ontario here. And my partner told me about this recent climate science person. I can't remember the guy. He's a great YouTube channel, talking about the guy from ExxonMobil being sort of revealed in having been sort of like espionage on behalf of what was it, Greenpeace? They had this Skype thing recorded, and he was basically being like, oh yeah, like, it doesn't matter what any of the regulations are. We have everything in place to go past them. And then him even saying like, oh yeah, we support, the carbon tax publicly, but it'll never go through because we've put in all the money we need in order to like make sure it doesn't. So we could support it on the surface, knowing that we'll never actually have to pay for it. And I got so angry. And this has not happened many times in my life, but I got so angry that I was like, I wanted people like that and like Jeff Bezos and these people, I wanted them brought out into the street and publicly executed. I was in so much rage. I'm like, you've earned this, you know, like your execution needs to be celebrated. I was like so angry. Mind you, eventually I got back to a place of compassion, although I'm still, I think, rightfully angry. It's less homicidal.
Welcome to the shadow, my friend.
But the other one was recognizing, like, if you think about where Jeff Bezos is at, if you look at his Wikipedia, it describes him as a corporate tycoon, which is so weird how language can frame the meaning of a thing, because it makes it seem like, whoa, corporate tycoon, oh, that's cool, you know? But if you think about it, Jeff Bezos has won our society. By this, I mean, like, he is on top. If there's the game, you know, how to win, he's won it. Literally, he's won it.
That's right.
And also, if you look at how he's won it, it's like he's almost, like you were saying, like cartoon level villainry. And what does it say about our society if the people who have won and succeeded to achieve everything society says is valuable and worthy of working towards is also like a villain, you know? And that's sort of like a little exploration for myself here, but I appreciate that you brought Bezos into the picture. Musk is a whole other weird, different rabbit hole we don't have to go into.
No, we don't want to go there.
Yeah. So in all of this, there is, to myself, it's undeniable, but of course, denial remains. But there is the strong reality, evidence-based, verified by science, reality that the consequences of this human culture, disease civilization, as you described it, is causing permanent, severe damage to our ecosystems, specifically worldwide climate, which is not weather. Weather is something that happens inside a climate, but a change in the climate structures, which is going to cause serious problems to us, but is already causing serious damage to, what was the report? 1 million species that have been killed, that have been rendered extinct, entire systems of life obliterated to, you know, like farm cattle or build a new Walmart, right? That this is happening, and the tipping point of this is we're like already in it. You know, like Jim Bendel says, it's like we're not stopping climate change anymore. We're in the crisis. Now what we need to do is adapt to the fact that this is our reality and try to mitigate the damage as much as we can while trying to work towards something better. And one of the things you brought up, Joanna Macy, and I know I'm going on for a bit here. I'm going to open this up. And there was a quote that you used in your book from Joanna Macy, which I think speaks to the value of like recognizing that this is happening. Because once we really recognize it, it breaks us. And recognizing that in the context of deep ecology, and the quote you use is from Joanna Macy, when you look at what is happening to our world, and it is hard to look at what's happening to our water, our air, our trees, our fellow species, it becomes clear that unless you have some roots in the spiritual practice that holds life sacred and encourages joyful communion with all your fellow beings, facing the enormous challenges ahead becomes nearly impossible.
Yeah, absolutely. She also underlines in a beautiful small interview that I'll send you later on that heartbreak and urgency that you just were speaking to, particularly around climate. We can make ourselves a little nutty and actually separate ourselves further by freaking out. And so that essentially she's saying, and I so much love her for this, is like she's saying like, oh, now that we have this collective Damocles sword that many of us are feeling into, what is our response? And so one message that I'm really, kind of honing is, yes, everything that you said is absolutely accurate in my estimation. And there's this miracle of being alive, of being able to love, of connecting with that familial kinship relationship with the rest of the universe. And that and in the way that I describe in my book as an organized life raft approach, is a good way to say it. That we're looking at this thing from, again, what can we do to mitigate, which to me pretty much looks like an impossibility. It looks as though we crossed the tipping point 10 or 15 years ago. And
sure,
so
and it's obvious that the governments aren't going to do anything but the absolute minimum.
Nobody in power, like you mentioned the oil industry before, nobody is going to, and this, what was it, COP, I can't remember the 20, climate
24,
26 or something like that, yeah. COP 26. It's like nobody is going to do anything about this on any serious level. So given that understanding, what are we going to do? And so that but fundamentally that approach of, my God, it's amazing to be alive and to make love, not just with your lover, but with life as a response to death being at our door. And I think that's one of the incredible things about being born now, is that instead of just the understanding that my physical individual life is going to die, there's a very real possibility that we're in the process of taking out a good portion of the biosphere. And how do I want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's, how do I want to respond to that? And so the inclination is, towards this celebration of life, this joy of reconnection. And there's one inference, and I think this is fair, that when we start making those changes personally and collectively, there's a rippling out effect that changes people's priorities. Now, whether or not that rippling out effect is going to be fast enough to prevent what's going to happen, who knows? But I think in this, and I know this is not what you're speaking to, or at least I have the sense that it isn't what you're speaking to, or not what you're calling for. But there's this sense of the possibility of being like, okay, how I'm going to respond is to create this type of connection in these isolated little communities over here. A retreat, literally a retreat to the retreat, and then stay there kind of thing. And I'm curious, especially since you talk about eco-spiritual activism, and you talk about, like John Seed, for example, who I got to meet in Australia a couple of years ago, which is so cool. What an amazing opportunity. There was some serious work being done to actively create change. So where do you see as the sort of balance, and how are you seeing the dynamics of sort of creating this way of being, this connection and the communities around it, and the actual efforts towards, calling for changes in policy and sort of civilizational institution?
Yeah, that's like the $64,000 question, and I love it. And the phrase that comes to mind is the Spanish chifladura, chifladura, and it means your craziness, your passion. And it's clear, James, that you're involved in your chifladura. And so many people are like, oh shit, we have to do something about this. And so we have to organize and we have to get into policy making. We need to make these structural changes. And it's like, ha, 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 ha. Hey, I've been a political and social activist for 40 years. Yes, that needs to happen. But when it happens from, I should do to this, as opposed to, actually, I'm a visionary artist and I need to make visionary art. I'm a freaking fantastic musician. I'm a permaculturist, and I'm an entrepreneur. I want to make money and I want to make it for myself and I want to help out good causes, whatever it is. You get my drift here, is that I see these changes happening because we have the healthy self-interest enough to listen to our own, let's say, alignment with creation, with source energy, with nature, whatever the hell you want to call it. We have enough self-respect to actually go in that direction and to essentially, in kind of theological terms, it's like everybody's given a gift by Creator. Are you going to use those gifts or not? And when I hear those kinds of words from other people, what I just said, this thing inside of me goes, oh my God, I can breathe, because I've been freaking out before about how I'm going to get everybody else lined up to prevent this awful thing from happening. And just to underline, I'm not saying by any means that those things don't need to be paid attention to on the structural level. And it's like, there are so many young people like I was in my 20s or 30s that are like, oh shit, we need to make these structural changes, let's say, fast forward to an alternative energy civilization like yesterday. Like, yeah, but only if that's your thing. Like, if you're like, hey man, I want to see, the biggest, baddest solar collectors all over the place, I'm on that. God bless you.
So there's a complex sort of responses, like one of which is having this sense of like, hurt people, healed people, heal people, healed peoples heal people structures, something like that. And then there's another part of me that there's like a skeptical response around like somebody being like, yeah, like I've connected with the fact that I make beautiful art and that's my thing. And so the skeptical response is it's not exclusive. There's a part of me that's like, oh, when somebody is living a beautiful life and like it's actually a beautiful life, that beauty resonates and that beauty itself has sort of a harmonizing action. And also it's hard, the critical part is it's hard for me to differentiate between when it's that and when it is sort of like the sort of self-satisfying contortion as a consequence of a me-focused civilization that orients us towards being more concerned about doing what I think is cool for me than what I think is probably my duty to those beyond me. And then, so then my that's where the skepticism is. It's like, okay, are you following me out? You see what I'm speaking to?
And here, what comes nicely around to how you began this whole conversation, which is your skepticism is still derived from the sense of the self, from the separate self. So that artist is not saying, let's just say, because we've put climate up in our faces, that artist is not saying, I'm doing my art and fuck the climate. That person is saying, I feel one with creation because I watched this podcast and I said, my number one priority is not me, myself, and I, and that's it. My my changing my perceptual apparatus is critical to this deep sea change that we're talking about here. And I happen to have my knowing that my outer function, my external gift to the world takes on this kind of particular form. But I think we all have, if I were going to be, let's say, and this is where language is difficult, if I were going to be slightly ideological about it, I would say that if we really care about life, then we're going to do everything we can primarily to be present, to be fully present here and now, to be in gratitude, to love fully, not from a sense of should, but because it's the best game in town. And that from that foundation is right action. And as I was saying before about, let's say, the structural people who are, as we speak, really, really getting on this thing about alternative energy sources, alternative to fossil fuels. But there's kind of like a million ways to jump in this thing. But I'm really wanting to emphasize this point. If we're jumping into this thing because we're freaked out, we're feeling separate, and we're feeling like, we got to do something quickly, we're actually taking part in the very vibration, if you will, which is the ecocidal tsunami that is underway. So what I think you and I are fundamentally talking about, and I'm just going to repeat that phrase again, is changing our perceptual apparatus so that we're not in that zero-sum game anymore.
Yeah, when you speak to changing the perceptual apparatus, also part of me while you were speaking was like, no, we have to be able to track it. I have to be able, if it's, there was like this, and I'm like, wow, that's a really intense response. There's a part of me that is really desperately afraid of what's happening right now. And fair enough. Enough. And it wants to be able to point to control it by explaining it. Fair enough. But when you were speaking to that, there was something about in that dynamic with myself, the recognition of like, oh, if I'm coming from a place of what it is to be really connected, there's the recognition that things are also connected beyond the ways in which I'm able to perceive them as connected. And that sort of ties back into something that I have been trying to cultivate in my life as a consequence of studying Stephen Jenkinson, which is like learning how to be with the mystery, learning the disciplined inquiry of wondering in the context of mystery rather than attempting to conquer mystery with knowing and conclusion. And there's something there about like, oh, that makes sense. Although I couldn't explain it, I could come up with some causal links. If the disposition somebody is in is based in this deep and profound connection that you're speaking to, then perhaps at some point they'll take ecological actions explicitly, but perhaps just as a consequence of that moving through the people they interact with, through what they're doing and how they're being, more of that will spread and more of that might incline us. And that part of me is still like, that seems pretty idealistic, seems pretty, almost borderline pathologically optimistic there, James. And also, why not at least add that into the mix? Because what you're speaking to, like if we go in with this energy, it's like, was it like violent regimes overthrown with violent actions are replaced with further violent regimes? And there's a lot of people, I think, that don't recognize that although they're calling for things like justice and they're calling for things like positive social change, they're engaging it in a way that is itself an iteration of the same thing that they're trying to create. And so they are actually just propagating the same thing they're fighting against with a different lens and calling it progress. And that's not to say, I'm not saying that all social justice is like that, but I'm saying some people do that on lots of levels in various places of their lives. And it does take that change in our perceptual apparatus. And I'm not claiming to know what that change is supposed to be or how it feels or what it is for every person, but definitely what you're speaking to, that change is important.
Yeah, I mean, Gandhi said it. We are the change we want, be the change we want to see in the world. And it's like, that's, to me, as straightforward and in your face. And also, I love that, I saw one short video with Stephen Jenkinson. I don't know very much about him, but what you just said about the mystery is so beautiful because, James, I'm humble enough to know that on some level, I don't know shit. These are like, right. these are like all like quick ideas that you and I have digested to. And so our intuition and our instinct says we're onto something really hot stuff here and cutting edge, or we wouldn't be wasting our time. But at the same time, there's got to be this sense of, and this is to kind of add into what you're saying, once I'm open to the miracle, which happens through this change in our perceptual apparatus, I'm open to the mystery that can create what Terence McKenna said is a shit for brains change. And he actually said, somebody could accuse me of having shit for brains, but this is kind of what I'm seeing, and this is what I'm visioning. And, there's a lot of good critiques about Terence, but he was one brilliant dude. And what you were, the skeptic in you was saying like, how could this level of positivity be even remotely possible? So anyway, it's great that you met John Seed, and I've got in front of me his quote from like 25 years ago, which I'll type out for you, or send you a picture of it, because all I have is the cutout from the Mother Earth News way back when. And so the interviewer says, "You don't make the future sound promising." So John says, "Not unless there is an incredible spiritual revolution, a new wave of consciousness that more or less sweeps through humanity in our generation. That may sound impossible, but it could happen. It would require nothing less miraculous than the miracle of us, by way of the other mammals, emerging from the sea, or of reptiles turning into birds. I know these things took place over long periods of time, but what we are talking about here isn't physical evolution, but a spiritual one. So it could be almost instantaneous."
That's great. That's a great thing to put into this discussion.
Is that a crazy thought, right?
Yeah.
But why not, right?
Yeah. And, given what you're speaking to about how, and then you live from that, you act from that. It's not a call to passivity. It's a call to action. But like you said, I think you used the term right action, which I think you had inferred it in regards to right as in like the Eightfold Noble Path of right action, right livelihood, and all the rest. Not right as in right, wrong, right as in alignment with the truth of being or something like that. I'm not much into Buddhism, so I don't know.
Precisely. That's exactly right. And as far as putting out, just like, and this is good, we're not going to spend too much time indulging in freaking out about what might happen. And by the way, I'll just say, throw in my like anti-racist thing here. It's usually white, middle-class, very educated people that are freaking out about climate change. The rest of the world has got serious problems that they're dealing with right here and right now. And they're not thinking about of course, not exclusively, but demographically, that is absolutely true. So what I was going to say is, not only do we not want to spend a whole lot of time freaking out about what looks very imminent on the horizon, but we also don't want to get whatever, crazy optimistic, in the sense of like, oh, well, I just need to sit back and get my consciousness in order, and like everything's just going to sort of like play itself out, and maybe we'll have this instantaneous mystical collective experience or something. That's airing on, that's going out of balance as well. So it's like really like coming into the present moment completely, dealing what's in front of us right now. And then this is my own little thing that is becoming truer and truer for me, is what is my truth in this moment, given what I'm cultivating more and more, which is that sense of all my relations, all our relations, what we've been speaking about, all our relatives, this more than Bill Pfeiffer personality person who's super conditioned by the colonized, again, so-called civilization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I want to like, for myself, but also for the conversation, double back down on how that sort of sense of that being that, what would you say, perceptual shift or perceptual change, the it has to be rooted in that being connected with the more than us, right? And that, like, it's like that is the sort of like resonant tone that guides in that connection. And if that's not there, there's no guarantees anyways, but if that's not there, the likelihood that one's sort of like actions aren't going to be aligned with the larger positive outcome, it's greater that it's less likely to happen.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the thing is that it's it's not, again, and I think that I've been so conditioned by way of my dad, who is just this like super left-wing activist, to like get in there, fight the good fight. And it's about sort of like this thing of, and it's this agita, this fear-based thing of, we've just got to do something. We've got to get everybody involved. We've got to get everybody on board. And it's a recipe for burnout, and it's steeped in suffering. So I guess what I'm saying is that changing that perceptual apparatus, you don't want that to become like oh shit, I gotta get into my I gotta get connected. I gotta take a bunch of mushrooms and I gotta get connected. It's more of like the intuitive understanding that we're suffering unnecessarily because we're looking through this lens of domination and separation, alienation, etc., and what we spoke about before, that human chauvinism of human superiority to the rest of nature. When we see how much pain and how much trauma is related to that, then it's just kind of like, I gotta change I gotta change what's going on here, how I'm living my life. But from a much more, I think, of healthy, obvious moving, like you put your hand on the stove. It's like you get your hand off of that stove, or else you're going to burn your hand off. And where nervous systems are built so that we take our hand off that stove. And I think that's actually a very good metaphor for what's going on a collective level.
The hand on the stove, and you said like when we see the pain, and when you said see, I know that what you meant was directly encounter, right? On a visceral, embodied level.
Correct.
That it changes us, that we like put our hands on the hot thing, we see the pain, and we're like, whoa, touching, why did I touch that? Why am I touching this? Why do I have this burner on? Like, what can I do to make it so that doesn't happen? Right. I'm not sure how far this metaphor goes out if I think about the warming earth and all the rest. But what I'm thinking to here is like two things. One, that is based on the premise that people are actually feeling that pain. and that the touching the stove metaphor works out the way you're describing it, and not the, oops, that's hot, I'll never look at that again, which is another possible way that someone might respond. Because
drugs, alcohol, suicide.
Sure. And on top of that, like video games, Netflix, shopping,
workaholism,
and any number of things, that you speak in the book, you speak about the necessity of being able to connect with feeling the pain of the earth, like feeling that pain. And what comes up for me is recognizing how debilitating that is. And because of the level of grief there is just so huge. And now I'm thinking about Francis Weller, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, and him talking about how, grief is always too much for one person to handle, regardless of what the grief is for. That's where community comes in. That community holds the grief. They grieve together, or they create the support for the grieving person to do the grieving. And so now I'm linking back into the Wild Earth Intensive, and what you talk about is the creation of these ecstatic cultures and creating contexts, social and cultural contexts, where people can feel safe, and I mean that neurobiologically, not comfortable, but safe enough to encounter that grief, rather than doing what I think is maybe not the best response, but a very reasonable response in a culture of isolation and urbanization and all the rest, to either deaden or distract, right? Creating spaces that create the opportunities for people to touch this grief and let the gravity of it inform them in a way that changes their perceptual systems.
Yeah, right on. I think you touched on essentially the formative experience that, when you asked me at the beginning, what about deep ecology? The critical piece was collectively, and we're talking about group sizes, let's say between 15 and 100, let's just say as a two kind of extremes, but it could be less and it could be more. But the willingness to say, James, this pain, like what's happening with orangutans or manatees, and I could go
salamanders.
down, or salamanders, or just all of these, I just love animals so much, and to feel into their disappearance is enormously painful. And I know that I can't, I can grieve a little bit on my own, but as you said, it's too much. And I need to be witnessed. And in a way, you and I are doing this right now by owning the fact that I'm sorry, but I'm from Brooklyn. It's fucking heartbreaking how much it hurts to know what's going on. But then what is so interesting that happens is you get together with these 15 to 100 people and you share that heartbreak together, and you cry and you rage and you shake, all in different emotive styles, or just witnessing, just speaking even in a normal tone of voice, but that you're being held by the group energy. Something absolutely amazing happens. And I feel like I'm starting to cry thinking about it, which is the beauty is that we start to open up to each other and to nature. We stop pushing down all that pain, and we're just we're with life, James. We're with each other. We're here. We're playing the game. We're not all that list of numbing things that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then in the experiences that I've had that are akin to that, although I haven't had the kind of experience you're speaking to in a group with a nature context and I would love to at some point in time in my life, is like those experiences have so much gravity that it's hard not to be changed as a consequence, like on a deep level of being seen and held in such an incredible way, and letting stuff that is so deep inside of you be seen and held, in a different context. The gravity of it, and this is a Francis Weller point too, is like the process of grieving that we go through in those contexts. It translates, or the sorrow, into a type of gravity that reorients our priorities towards what is most valuable. And with regards to what you're speaking to about then stepping out of that into how do I show up in the world given everything that's happening?
I couldn't have possibly said it better myself. I think that totally nails it. And again, like we've been speaking about, this isn't philosophy. It's based on life experience. And when you're in a setting like that, and you feel I'm feeling it as we talk about this, the pain, the common grief, the common pain, the common rage, as you spoke about earlier in terms of ExxonMobil execs and stuff like that. When we're open to that, and the fear, because there's a lot of fear associated with what we're talking about here. But fair enough. But when we're honest with ourselves, and we're honest with ourselves collectively, we just raise up to a whole different level. And as you said, it becomes about values, about how we're living our life. And, we're all reprioritizing our values, even as we speak, like what's most important to me. And I think that the beautiful thing about breaking open, which is what we're talking about, our heart breaking open to this more than human world, is that we start making changes in our lives about how we're spending our time, who we're spending our time with, how, as I was saying earlier, about are we going to share our gifts, or are we going to pretend that we can just go on business as usual, doing the same old stuff, the same old unhealthy routines? And what we're both saying is, yeah, we can do it, but it's ultimately very, very unsatisfying, and it's laden with suffering.
Mm-hmm. And of course, those changes aren't easy by any means, especially when you go back, right? It's obvious, like it's just a obvious statement of the universe or something like that. Most obvious statement in the universe is, you go back and it's like, one of the things I think about is I want to act in sustainable ways and live a sustainable life and contribute to these things. And of course, as someone living in an urban environment, of course, there's really accessible ways, like trying to make sure that I only buy plastics that are actually recyclable and recycling them, right? Or, like not littering, or deciding I'm just going to clean up litter. Or, also I hold this as something is like walking in the forest and loving the forest and thanking the forest, something like this, but there are those types of actions in the urban environment that I can take. But being that I'm nested inside of this urbanized system, it's nearly impossible to truly live a sustainable life within it, because it is founded on institutions that are unsustainable. Like, where's my electricity come from? I can reduce my electricity, but where's it coming from? I'm still inevitably going to be creating waste. How's that waste being managed? I can do my best, but, and then with regards to, say, the products that I buy, I live in a system where my primary daily involvement,
that microphone,
right? Yeah. Or the cobalt in my phone. Yeah. I live in a system where my daily role in that system generally is consumer, right?
Yep.
But I can't afford sustainable, ethical products because I've chosen to do this as my life thing, because I felt like that was my way in. And from what I understand, it seems like the only people who actually can afford buying those sustainable things are people who are likely earning money in unsustainable industries. So it's like, in the midst of all of this, like, yeah, we can change and all the rest, there's also the reality of coming back being like, and none of that is going to like mean that it's just like a switch and it's easy, or it's like going to be easily available. You know, like I still struggle with it. Yeah, I can assume I will continue to struggle with it for the rest of my life, and that is a struggle that has value. But yeah.
And you and I are doing the best we can. And it's very important to realize that we didn't invent this system. We were born into it. And it's the result of the colonized perceptual apparatus that we've talked about since the beginning. So that is, it's a horrible thing on some level to understand about, let's just say, North American consumerism, but we can't afford. We can do the best we can, but we can't afford to get anal compulsive about it, because we've got more important work to do. In my view, meaning we do the best we can, we buy the products we can, we live as ecologically as we understand how to do, given the larger framework of our lives and all the choices that we need to make. And then, we roll up our sleeves in the way that we've been implying and, in my sense, catalyzing in each other and in the audience. I guess I want to say guilt sucks, and it doesn't serve us. Like, again, we just do the best we can, but it's counterproductive.
Yeah, I mean, it's counterproductive after a certain point, right? Like, if the guilt or the shame is like a signal that orients you to having made a mistake,
right?
And from that place, there's a call to, like, be accountable, ownership, changing, all these things. That's like, oh, what I'm getting from this is that was a mistake, and I'm gonna do different, and I'm gonna make up for it, and that's that. Rather than having it become sort of like chronic guilt and chronic shame, which is not a signaling. It's not a signpost towards positive change. It's a sort of like a heavy blanket that just holds you down. Yeah.
It's more separate self-consciousness.
Mm-hmm. So, looking at time and wanting to be conscientious of it, Bill, there are so many other questions I have. This is just such a rich exploration. Maybe one day you'll be back on the show, but before we end out, I would really like to explore psychedelics, because in your book, you talk about the role of altered states. Now, you don't talk about psychedelics. You actually sort of like lean into talking about shamanic journeying, which is a type of non-psychoactive agent-induced altered state. But I don't want to talk about that here. You talk about it in your book. I want to hear what your thoughts are on where you see the role of psychedelic plants in this reorientation towards connection and nature and all this.
Well, we wouldn't be talking to each other if it wasn't for the for the shamanic medicine plants, for the power plants, and of course, fungi is another kingdom all into itself. I mentioned Terence earlier, and I'm with him in that if we're living in a eco-fascist civilization, meaning this dominator paradigm that's got us basically on our knees, and that we've spoken to it over and over again about the level of suffering. We need some strong effing medicine to break out of the egoic box. And so it's a tool. It's a fabulous tool. And I tell my groups here that, I tell the groups that I lead that the difference between, generally speaking, the 60s and the 21st century is the difference between recreation and ceremonial use. And that I'm not down on anybody who uses them recreationally. And it's possible that, not only possible, it's probable that that's a kind of entry into the psychedelic realm. However, once you understand, and you bring this out so beautifully in your book, is that we bring our trauma, we bring our shadow into every single experience, and so the ceremonial use of, let's just narrow it down to mushrooms for just because that's where my own preference is these days, that doing so ceremonially, I can't believe I'm saying this, but gives us the most bang for our buck. That we have the deepest chance of the realization of that numinous perception of reality, and that it also gives us something that you've spoken to several times and is the most important thing for me, which is community. Sangha is the Buddhist term. Tribe or clan, if you want, in the indigenous context. That this is the human frame to do these shamanic plants and particularly mushrooms in. And I'm just going to go like straight into it, which is that all the shamanic teachings that I have been honored and privileged to receive, both in this country and in Siberia particularly, but also Central America and Australia to a lesser degree, is that actually I lost my train of thought. I started thinking about Australia. That you don't need that you have this community orientation before, during, and after changing our perceptual apparatus through, in this case, the mushrooms or other shamanic plants. And so where I lost my train of thought is that in those cultures that I mentioned and the shamanic teachings I received, it's like the fungi, the plants are like 1/100th of what the teachings are about, and that living, embodying all our relations, which is kind of pretty much my favorite phrase for this kinship relationship with all of life. That's where the rubber meets the road. So that this life raft orientation is a community orientation, and it's an understanding that our destiny lies in our origins, and that we don't have to figure this out as separate self-moderns. We have built into our DNA, and fortunately, a hell of a lot of really kick-ass native people to help us all make this transition from a ecocidal world into a life affirming world. Now, I just said a mouthful, but I think you got what I was trying to say.
Yeah, and that and with that last statement, and that the use of psychedelic plants in ceremonial contexts that are in service to that sort of larger transition, that larger learning process, have an incredible capacity to sort of like supercharge it.
Good word. Great.
Is that, yeah?
Exactly. And I think that I'm speaking to what did I say? Like a leaning into that ceremonial is also mature developmentally and psychologically relatively sophisticated, and that we're using these things as a tool to make these changes in that I think of mushrooms as soul development accelerators, and there's no difference for me into, if I'm going to accelerate the development of my soul, I am leaning into that greater benign reality that we've been talking to from the beginning of this conversation, that deep ecological perception. But yeah, I know I'm repeating myself, but I think as long as it's done for me in a mature way that is cognizant of this, let's just call them roughly indigenous practices, authentic indigenous practices. Maria Sabina comes to mind, and that was syncretic. I mean, that wasn't sort of pure Mazatec. That was a big time Christian influence on her, but she did a fabulous job of it. And without her, we might not even be having this conversation. So, but I think she brought a level of maturity to this this greater conversation, which is, for me, just really important for people to lean into what that actually means. And again, I'm not sure if I said it, but that using your book as a sort of, all right, this is the starting place, and then I'm gonna include this ceremonial content. I mean, ceremony with a big C.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, not a particular aesthetic or something. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. And also, with that sort of sophistication of ceremony, developed aside, also, being in a safe place with good friends out in a natural area, taking some mushrooms, and you can touch that too. Now, yes. Whether or not it's going to have the same capacity to serve this sort of reconnection process that we're talking about to the same extent, well, maybe not, depending on a lot of variables. But certainly, yes, I believe, especially mushrooms themselves, I feel like that's actually what they want to do for us. We just need to create the context psychologically, externally, in order to unhinder the fruiting of that intelligence through our experiences. And ceremony is an excellent way to do that.
Yeah, it's not that I'm going to retract what I said. I think that I can be kind of fuddy-duddy because I lived through, I was a child and teenager during the 60s and early 70s. So I'm sort of aware of the excesses that happened then. So I'm kind of leaning into this indigenous context, but at the same time, I loved what you just said. I get together with my friends. It's a beautiful day in nature. And this is the critical word that you used, is that somehow there is an understanding that this is a safe place, that somebody is holding integrity of maintaining a certain level of a safe space that can make all the difference in the world, and that what is it? Cyanesis, afflorescence, and what's the other? What's the azurescence? Like that. Those three aspects of the magic mushroom. They work with our neurotransmitters, and boom, I think we're experiencing the kind of higher states of consciousness that are really important. And as we know, it's not a given because a whole lot of traumatic material can come up in the process. So that's why that
and like I say, I speak to it in the book, but I speak to it in my new book even more so. Like actually bringing up that traumatic material is a necessary prerequisite to the connection, because it's being stuck in that and it being stuck in you that's creating disconnection. So the decomposition of the shadow, which I speak to in the book, is actually freeing up those blockages so that our connection can be nourished. And so it's actually serving the connection even by bringing that up. But if we don't have context to understand that, we might just think like, oh, this is bad, this is wrong, I don't want this, so on and so forth, which we don't have to go into. That's in the book, and it could be another conversation.
But James, there's something really important there, which is daily life, which is that we have a lot of parts to our psychology, each one of us. And there's a tendency to reject the parts we don't like and accept the parts we do. And so part of spiritual and psychological maturity is befriending those aspects that previously we didn't like for all sorts of reasons. And I think actually that breathing into those various difficult states during a mushroom journey, breathing in through with as much kind acceptance as we can muster, is a beautiful, beautiful part of this process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially with mushrooms, because to me, my personal belief, it's a borderline conviction, is that when we're in right relationship with the mushroom, it's holding us in that too. And if we surrender onto it, then it's gonna, like, the compassion, the care, all the rest that comes up, it's like it's bringing us there. It's showing it. Well, I'm talking too much about the new book. I'm gonna leave that aside. So one thing we're getting close to time. There's something I really want to ask you about. It's pointing at a piece of language that I want to sort of like speak to and then wonder about where you're coming from with it, because it seems to be based in from where I'm coming from, sort of in contrast to what we've been talking about, which is and I think possibly it's a consequence of responding to your experience of growing up in the 60s, which is that you spoke of the psychedelics, like the mushrooms, as tools, which to me, I think that language is actually quite problematic, because we're taking this living thing, this living entity, our brother, our sister, and we're saying that it is an extension of our hand with which we expect or extract or act out our will, and that it creates a relationship of getting rather than a relationship of communion. And so for me, I think about the ceremony, the psychotherapy, those are the tools, right? The mushroom, that's the ally, that's the teacher, that's the facilitator, And so with that said, I'm just wondering about your language and the use of tool there.
As we say on the basketball court, my bad. Like, it's absolutely you're good one, and good correction. And I will never use that phrase again, because I was using it in a sort of unconscious fashion. And I think that we can expand the definition of what tools mean, but the tools of the industrial so-called revolution and the post-industrial revolution are, by and large, lethal and objectifying, and so out damn spot.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, Bill, on that note, I would love to bring our interview to a close. This has been Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Back at you.
How can people listening here, how can they follow what you're doing? How can they get your book? Maybe give the download. What is the book? Where can you access it? Where can you follow what you're doing?
Good. I'm going to just insert one thing before I answer that question, which the fungi as teachers are opening us up to the ongoing revelation of nature. It's like they're almost like concentrated medicine. And they're like, and that concentrated medicine is expanding us into this greater intelligence that is there all the time. And so I sort of think of the mushroom or the fungi just being like the tip of the crystal or the tip of the iceberg, whatever metaphor you want to use, where it's like it opens us up to this. I love the word, this ongoing revelation of nature, which is here for us 24/7. We just need to lean into it and have an intention of reconnecting. So anyway, people can...
Wait, can I speak that? You have to have the connection of the intention of reconnection. I think that this is so beautiful because I know there's a lot of narrative right now, like magic bullet narrative, cure for depression narrative, like narratives around like more mushrooms means less ecological destruction and like less authoritarianism on all the rest. And that just like patently isn't true, because as much as the mushroom might be inclining that direction, it wants to do that. It's so easy for us to get in its way that we have to be actively cultivating and calibrating ourselves towards that relationship that allows it, that I use the language in the book, that unhinders its ability to express that intelligence. And if we don't do that, there's no guarantee. It's not to say it definitely won't, but there's no guarantee that it's going to show up and provide the type of connection that you're talking about here, that we're talking about here.
I have a great Buddhist teacher. His name is Joseph Goldstein. Somebody should Google him because he's such an awesome, wise, humble person. And I quote him in the book, and he just, the shorthand is intention is paramount. And that we get to choose what our intention is at all times, and then that sets into motion all kinds of things. So anyway, I know you want me to answer this this last question, which I'm happy to. So it's billpfeiffer.org, BILLPFEIFFER.org. I'm loving this name, which was given to me on a vision quest in 1998, which is Sky Otter. I am definitely loving people calling me Sky. Bill seems like an old persona that I use legally, so I'm loving Sky. And I think everything that anybody wants to kind of get the download on me is just go to the website, and it's there. There's videos, podcasts, and I just filled up this beautiful program called Landscape Shamanism. And I have to say, I said this in my broadcast email, I'm just as excited about it as the Wild Earth Intensive, that although there's more, I think, lasting power in a Wild Earth Intensive because it's so intense over the 10 days. This landscape shamanism course has this lighter feather power that I'm loving, because I've done enough of the prerequisite to the course to know the power it has. And I think I'm going on a little bit about it simply because I'm very, very eager, for all the reasons we've been talking about, for the replicability of what this course is about. And so if anything, people should just kind of like, oh, core program. They can do a vision quest. They can do a Wild Earth intensive next year as soon as we get it up there. But they should look at this landscape shamanism as a way of like, oh yeah, I'll bet you I don't need Sky Otter to replicate this. If I put my mind to it, I can get my brothers and sisters and we can lean into this. And for that matter, if anybody listens to this, wants to email me, and my email is on the site, I'm happy to, spend some pro bono time. If somebody is like really jazzed about this, like I'm happy to talk with them and say, these are some things that you might want to do because it's called re-indigenizing. We've got to really make we don't have to, because I've been saying we don't have to do anything, but it is a wonderful, wonderful orientation to learn where the fuck do we live? Like, what's the topography? What's the botany? What's the geology? And what's the energy frequency of the land that we live in? I could go on.
Okay, great. So, you said billpfeiffer.com, right?
.org.
Billpfeiffer.org. Pfeiffer.
Correct.
And is the shamanic landscaping, is that a one-time course that's happening at a certain time? Is it pre-recorded?
No, it is a in-person that is based at my yurt in Putney, Vermont. So it is not one time. It is the beginning of. I intend to offer them possibly twice a year. But where what I'm emphasizing in this conversation is that I'm really jazzed about the replicability, and I think that with a sharp person who is versed in the whole worldview that we've been discussing, they could jump right into this. So they should get the book from their local bookstore or their indie bookstore first and foremost. Wild Earth, Wild Soul, a manual for an ecstatic culture, because we didn't talk about ecstasy, but that's a big part of where I'm coming from, that they can get the book and sort of see the website, get the book, they get the whole sort of like picture. And then again, my dream, James, is that each person takes what we've been talking about and evolves it in their own way with integrity.
Beautiful. Well, I will make sure, in case people forget, to look up billpfeiffer.org, that the links to that will be in the show notes of this episode at jameswjesso.com, where you can find all other episodes of the podcast. And Sky Otter, thank you so much for being on the show, for offering your time, and for offering what I'm experiencing as very good work in the world right now on behalf of all of us.
Thank you, James. It's been a real pleasure. A great way to spend a couple of hours. Awesome. Thank you.
And cut. Okay, so that was the interview with Sky Otter. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that you take a moment to go check out his work further and explore his book, maybe his landscaping course. Additionally, he is actually going to be running a sort of getaway adventure retreat. What's the word I'm looking for? Expedition to Russia. And I left links for that in the description of this episode too, if you'd like to join him to go to Russia and connect with the indigenous people there. So there's a link to that in the show notes of this episode at jameswjesso.com. So check that out. If you enjoyed this episode, great. Please tell somebody about it. Share it with a friend. And also, you could give back financially to this show. This is my full-time work. This plus the larger body of work that supports it. The reading, the research, the writing, all of this supports what you get to enjoy here on Adventures Through the Mind. And My patrons on Patreon specifically allow me to do it as my full-time job and earn an income, and I'm so grateful for that. And if you're receiving value from the show, I ask that you do give back financially to reciprocate that value by becoming a patron or leaving a one-time donation. With a one-time donation in mind, big thanks to Bernie, Peter, and La Winder, who offered some very generous donations recently, so thank you. Yes. If you can't contribute financially to the show, that's fine. Other people are contributing financially, and some give more than I asked for, which is about a cup of coffee, and they help to compensate for people who are not able to, while also keeping this podcast space and the content space of the show around psychedelic culture free of the manipulations that come with needing sponsorships and advertising and whatever else. So thank you for supporting the show financially or non-financially. Patreon.com/James to be Jesso, or any of the links in the description to this episode for different support options. One last sort of encouragement is that if you want to stay in touch and not have to rely on the social media algorithms to keep us linked together, please sign up for my newsletter. I release a monthly digest of things that have come out since the last monthly digest, and very periodically an update newsletter. So please sign up for my newsletter, also linked in the description to this episode. And finally, I hope that the content of this interview resonates with you in your year to come in 2022. And I hope that you have a beautiful year and that your closing of 2021 is or was beautiful, despite a lot of things seeming to edge us away from beauty. And to close us out, I'm going to read the quote that I started the show with from Joanna Macy, because it's so beautiful. When you look at what's happening to our world, and it's hard to look at what's happening to our water, our air, our trees, our fellow species, it becomes clear that unless you have some roots in a spiritual practice that holds life sacred and encourages joyful communion with all your fellow beings, facing the enormous challenges ahead becomes nearly impossible. That's Joanna Macy, and I hope that this interview with you inspires you to find that spiritual practice, set those roots, and find and develop and get what you need in order for us to all collectively face what's happening. So yeah, Happy New Year, and take care.